In a participatory society or a democracy, almost everything we do that can be considered communication is political in some way, in that it often deals with the power dynamics that are constructed within the socially maintained frameworks of the society itself. And so today we'll be talking about communication, social advocacy, and society. Social advocacy, in its simplest form, is a social argument, oftentimes concerning a topic or issue, or even a moment of contention or controversy. And oftentimes, formal statements that are considered social advocacy deal with historical forms of marginalization and oppression. They take forms in everyday conversation. They take forms in institutional and governmental policy. They take the form of individual celebrations and sufferings, and they also take the forms of various symbolic artifacts. And so the rainbow flag here, oftentimes considered a symbolic form of social advocacy that advocates for LGBTQIA rights. And so when we see this flag, we associate it with this historical context of marginalization that consists and plays out today. And so behind this flag is an argument for social inclusivity. And what better a symbol than the various colors of the rainbow here, all being seen as equal and inviting others to find their place within society on an equal footing with everybody else. And so it's also constantly expanding, right? As we look at lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender issues, and then start to add queer or questioning, intersex, or asexual, and allied as we expand our society to include LGBTQIA identifying folks, and even allied people that support the cause and are for inclusivity. And so, just because you are for inclusivity, that doesn't mean that you are against the presence of anybody else. It just simply means that you are against the domination of one identity or one group over the identities of others. And so, rhetoric and dialectic in a participatory society, this is the foundation. Open dialogue, a open space, the democratic space, or the participatory space of the public sphere in which people can debate the notions of reality and some of the most important issues of the time. And so, as we move forward, we will continually look for those moments where we can encourage dialogue and think about if our own communicative acts are opening up this space or shutting down this space. And so freedom of speech, it is in the Constitution, and it is the First Amendment because it is that powerful for voicing people's opinions and changing society in hopefully more inclusive ways. And so communication is the foundation of democracy. And as we have been continuing to look at the importance of rhetoric in society, both historically and today. And so the goal of social advocacy is to listen critically, but also compassionately. And so listen with rigor and with attention, but also with empathy, and attempt to be kind to the perspective of others, knowing that you have a perspective that is also different from the way other people see the world. And that is some of the risk and also some of the reward that comes with communicating and speaking to other people, especially other people that we have not known for a long time or that are not in our familiar friend and family networks. And so the object is inclusive excellence, as they say in various institutional, to find out and seek out those multiple perspectives. So, just in the pursuit of knowledge and accuracy, we can have a more thorough and better understanding of the worlds that we live in. And so, in an effort to move towards a more inclusive future, we add on. And so, LGBT becomes LGBTQIA. The rainbow flag, consisting of those colors that we previously saw, now is extended to include a black and brown bar to represent persons of color, and then particular transgender issues with the light blue, pink, and white bars now also being added. And so, as we see this expansive notion in this form of social advocacy symbolism, we can see the argument. And so, that's the point here for this lecture, is to look at social advocacy and see the levels of argumentation that exist behind some of these symbols that we have come to understand. And so, what's really going on here is representation. We're seeing a representation. This is a model, this is a symbol, and so it's reductive. It does not adequately represent the territory. And so, the suffering involved and the bodily harm that has been produced by a society that excludes certain individuals, right, is not fully encapsulated in the symbol here. Yet, we can still see a certain leaning towards a symbolic representation. And as we see that symbolic representation, as we see intersex, for example, marked within that gender and sex binary of male and female, we see a small space being etched out for individuals to be represented. And then we go out and we find a symbolic space as well to further that representation. And so, this is really what's at stake: the presence, the existence of people and their identities. And so, you just might ask yourself, slow down here and ask yourself, why is this important? Why is this even necessary? Why am I listening to a lecture on communication, society, and social advocacy? And how can society be better from such dialogue? This is the law of the land. This is the way of the democracy and the participatory societies that we have come to etch out in human existence. But why is this so? And how can we be better from such dialogue? When do we engage in social advocacy? Are we always engaged in social advocacy? Can I ever take a day off? Or can I ever just sit back and enjoy reality for what it is, rather than trying to change it? That is really up to us. And these are all individual and personal questions that we might ask. But once again, questions are usually nice for opening up that space of dialogue, which is one of the primary factors in recognizing voices, no matter what perspective they happen to represent. And so, I think that one of the hardest things to do is to open up that space to a potential voice that you might not be ready to hear. And so, as poet and activist feminist Audre Lorde states, where and when should we engage in social advocacy? Where the chains chafe us most. And so, where we feel the most friction from society, when we feel the most excluded, and when we don't feel represented, and when we observe and understand the pain and suffering of others, these might be the moments to engage in deliberate social advocacy. I also might note that we engage in smaller levels of social advocacy every day. Every dollar that we spend, every choice that we make, and action that we engage in, typically a certain way of life and advocate doing things in a certain way. And so, inequality, disparity in access to power, wealth, and influence. You can see in this graph in the United States, the rich have been getting richer since the 1980s, and since before that, um, while those in the bottom 50% of the wealth bracket have continually been going down. And so that disparity is getting worse in a rich developed nation such as the United States. Disparity in wealth is the worst in the world. And so number one in disparity of wealth. And so this is a classic class and economic example of inequality. And so marginalization and exclusion based on access to material wealth and therefore power is at work here. We could find inequalities in various contexts. Advocacy, speak and communicate in favor for public change. And so when you take a look at the world around you, you might ask yourself if everything is perfect. Can there be any improvement in society? And most people will agree that yes, we can improve society as a whole in some way. This is where social advocacy comes into play. And so Stokely Carmichael here, I'm delivering a lecture in Berkeley, California in the 1960s on Black Power. Speaks is a classic example of speaking and communicating in favor for public change. What becomes before Black Power is the context of white normativity and white superiority in terms of access to wealth and power in the United States. And so Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement comment on this context and issue their own form of power and affirmation in Black Power, which in many eyes is a logical response to the context of marginalization and exclusion. And so Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator and activist here, gives us this notion of critical pedagogy and discusses in his work the differences between teaching as oppression versus teaching as liberatory. And so his book, The Critical Pedagogy, is a widely read text that revolutionizes the way individuals teach. And so Bell Hooks here has a series of books teaching to transgress, notably, that extends these ideas of Freire into the more contemporary spheres that marks the way we use and produce and disseminate knowledge. And so Freire comes up with two different modes of education. The classical banking model, which many of us are familiar, and I'll describe here, and critical pedagogy, or problem-solving learning, a more liberatory form of education. And so the banking model deals with the dissemination of information, knowledge, power, and in turn, perspectives that are deployed in the classroom and disseminated to students, and students are encouraged to check their hats at the door and to not think about their identities, their own personal histories, or their own cultural ways of understanding the world. And so you can see as a classroom, as students start to populate any given class in any given semester on any given campus, they all represent a much a different background. And so coming into a space, the banking model would encourage most people to forget what they already know about a given subject and become passive receptacles ready to receive the knowledge of the teacher, the professor, the class, the department, and then the university, and then dominant society as a whole. What happens at the end of the semester? You cram for that final test, you write that final paper, deliver that final speech, and you empty it all out. What happens after you empty it all out? The next day after that final, pausing for you to answer or contemplate, you forget everything that you learned. And the reason for this is because that's part of the educational process in many ways. You empty that space because you need to be ready to absorb more. And the more you start to contemplate some of these concepts and question what you are learning, you oftentimes get taken away from being able to cram more information and even get that right answer on the test. And so, in an effort to combat this form of learning and education, critical pedagogy sees students as active producers of the knowledge being discussed in any given context. And so, the banking model produces a hegemonic notion of knowledge in society. And so, hegemony, borrowed from Antonio Gramsci, an Italian writer and activist. And so, hegemony, if we don't question what we are learning, we might just add to and support hegemonic forms of information, knowledge, and power that are already occupying the dominant position in terms of learning and perspective in society. And so, hegemony is domination by consent. And it's just the various ways in which we consent to our own domination, oftentimes willingly, because we live in that power context. And it would be risky. It would almost be, it would be unsafe to engage in a different type of perspective for us. And so this is a process of granting some groups the power to shape our worldviews, expectations, and even our actions. And so you might just think about the certain ways you go along with the status quo in your everyday life, or the ways in which others cater to a perspective that might be seen as orthodox, traditional, or the status quo in any given society. And you can think about how it's risky to alter or change your behavior. And so Paulo Freire offers critical pedagogy, or problem solving or problem posing education, where collectives and learning collectives or classes engage in solving some of the world's and society's problems. The context in which the class takes place, the political situation of that class becomes of utmost importance. And so problem posing education affirms men and women as being in the process of becoming. And so this knowledge is in the process of unfolding, and we will all be different folks as we come to the conclusions regarding the truthfulness of any situation. And so critical communication pedagogy is a subfield of the communication discipline, and oftentimes discusses reflexivity, a big part of critical pedagogy. The process of thinking about how we act, why we act, and what that means is to be reflexive of your forms of communication and your actions and your expectations. And we might think, whenever I do or say anything, who is this enabling? And also, who might this be hurting? Who is this inviting in and celebrating? And who might this be excluding? Even if it's just simple statements that we say, or simple actions that we do every day. You also might become reflexive of or reflect on the actions of others at the same time. But reflexivity is often used with a self in front of it. And so self-reflexivity. How are we aware of our own actions and our own words? So praxis. Lastly, Paulo Freire offers us praxis, reflection and action on the world in order to transform it. And so praxis is theory and reflexivity um, moved in to a plan for action. And so when you think about how am I going to change the world, um, and what am I going to change about the world, how am I going to do this? And now you have a praxis, a plan, really. And so consideration of the learning situation, and consciencial, a Portuguese term that means consciousness. And Paulo Freire used this term along with consideration. And so considering the worlds that we live in is very important here for critical pedagogy. And so how do we achieve this consciousness of any given situation? It must be done collectively. We cannot do it on our own. And so if a teacher marks down, gives you a concept and says this is the right concept, and then everybody in class gets on board and doesn't and is unreflexively reproducing this term and the meaning of this term, he would not call that a true word. He might call that a false word, even though it might be true in that class context, right? But this is not considering the world in an educational context. This is education as domination. And so dominating the concept by telling everybody what the right meaning of the phrase or term is. And so to produce consciousness, this must be done in a collective manner. The goal here is to produce critical awareness of what knowledge produces. What types of knowledge are we producing? Who is harmed and who is enabled by the understanding of the world in this particular way? And so we can do that all along the way, becoming critical of the knowledge that we are not only learning, but also producing. And so as we become co-producers of knowledge and we move forward, we might think about knowledge and communication as tools to produce a given material reality. And I like the tool and the production metaphor because we often think of these as material pursuits. But if we slow down and we think about how powerful language is and how powerful words are, and that's why it is protected by the Constitution first and foremost, is because these symbolic utterances are just as important as material items that produce visceral realities. And so learn to use knowledge and question how and why we think the ways we do is to engage in education as liberatory. And it's also to think about how we might engage in social advocacy through our forms of communication to produce a more inclusive society, one that actively searches out, recognizes, and learns from the perspectives of various folks. Thank you.